Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Vermont Bookshop. My name is Jenny. I do the marketing and events here. Yay, Jenny! It's Independent Bookstore Day, which is a day that we take once a year to celebrate independent bookstores and what they bring to a community. So thanks for coming out to support our author events. You're in for a treat today. This is a fantastic book. If you haven't read it yet, Hold Fast by Marshall Hyatt and Stasz Jones. It's a great read. I loved it. Picked it up. Couldn't put it back down. So enjoy the show. Oh, this is Bird.
Well, as you can tell, it's just me. So I will now step in briefly for Marshall, who is stuck in New York with 5 canceled airplane flights, lost baggage, and she and I had a rather tearful moment. So I'm going to try to do justice to this book, which really was a collaboration with the two of us. And I promised Marshall that I'm going to read the things that she would have read, and hopefully I'm going to say at least some of the things that she would have said. So this really starts, and it's really Marcia Adams' fault. Because as we all know about Marcia, she is the best matchmaker in Middlebury. And it began, which as I call it, there's 2 paragraphs at a Pilates class. And Marcia is in the Pilates class, and she comes to me and she says, "Bert, do you know Mary Marshall?" And I said, "No, I don't. Mary Marshall, do you know Bert?" No, she doesn't either. Well, the two of you absolutely have to get to know each other because you both write. That's like saying we both breathe. But nevertheless, we, met each other, and I said, "So Mary Marshall, what do you write?" She said, "Oh, I'm a fiction writer." And I said, "Well, I'm a nonfiction writer, and I've got 2 paragraphs. And I've been thinking about these 2 paragraphs for years. I think it'd make a good story. How about writing the book together?" And she said, "Sure." What could possibly go wrong? So, here are the 2 paragraphs, and they really exist. And as we all know, New Englanders in the late 1800s loved to write about themselves and their families. So, in the chronicles of this book is the beginning of this story. And it starts with, "We find nothing which furnishes any information with regard to the early boyhood of Joseph Carlo. When he was not far from 12 years of age, he was sailing one day on the Mediterranean in company with his relative Suchet of about the same age. They were in a small vessel belonging to his uncle and were on their way to some place in Sardinia. Having sailed some distance from the coast, they were overhauled by an English man of war and ordered to lay to. The commander, attracted by the appearance of the 2 Italian lads, decided to impress them into his service as cabin boys. The entreaties of the officers of the little bark were of no avail, and the boys were kidnapped from their homes. The vessel returned to Nice, bearing the sad news of the seizure of the 2 children, whose parents, we cannot doubt, bitterly mourned their loss. Although it cannot now be ascertained with certainty upon which English ship young Moran was impressed, there is good reason to think it was the Deptford of 50 guns. It is known that in May 1760 she sailed from St. Helena for the Mediterranean, where she cruised till August of that year, at which time she was near England. Under Admiral Rodney, she sailed on the 14th of that month for the coast of France, and on the 18th of November following from Portsmouth under the command of Captain Digges, having a convoy of 33 ships. After touching at Madeira, she arrived in Jamaica January 19, 1762. In July of the same year, she appears to have been at Havana, which was besieged by a large fleet under Admiral Keppel. The Morro Castle surrendered July 30th, after which we hear no more of the movements of the Deptford. In that tropical climate, the losses of men by heat and fever were great. Invalid troops, prostrate by disease, were placed on transports and carried to New York. It is thought that Joseph Carlo was a cabin boy on board one of those transport hospital ships. Many had been unsuccessful attempts made by the lad to escape from his English captors, but at last he was so fortunate as to be one who was sent on shore at New London, Connecticut to procure watering casks. Scarcely had she touched land when he sprang out and ran with all his speed to a field where some farmers were at work. His acquaintance with the English language stood him in good stead, for it enabled him to tell the story of his cruel imprisonment and to claim their protection. An effort was made by his companions to force him to return to the boat, but the sturdy Connecticut yeomen drove them away with their hoes and other instruments. And thus, in a moment, and most unexpectedly, his not far from 2 years' captivity came to an end. Okay.
There we go.
There we go. So that is the spine for which this book stands on. There's a process for this, and it's an odd process. And I've been asked by many people, how do two people collaborate? Well, we have sort of three things. We have three sort of rules that we follow. One is the idea of a truth pin. A truth pin is that thing which is, no matter what you do to it, it's true. And you can hang it on the spine of the story, and you have to pay attention to it, because that is keeping you metaphorically on course. The other thing that we have developed was this notion of time passes, time passes, time passes. In other words, how do you condense all this stuff into something that is truthful but is not so boring to read that your eyeballs fall out. And then the third and most important thing is coffee. How much coffee can two people drink? How much time can they spend in Carol's hungry mind without being booted out? So, and here, if Mary Marshall were here, she would step in, because this is her part of it. What is that tension between a fiction writer and a nonfiction writer? My great admiration and love of Mary Marshall is that she has the most fabulous imagination. And she also, as a writer of young adult literature, the cool part is you get to release your inner 12-year-old, which means that you can roll about in the details of barfing and peeing and flogging and all those gross things that the average 12-year-old, which I think secretly both of us are, appreciate. But, so in this book, there's lice, and disgusting, and maggots, and pestilence, and storms at sea. And a good young adult writer can kill off entire villages, no problem, but no pigs can die and no dogs can die. Those are the rules. And so there is this balance between the very real and very serious world that these two young men, Joseph Carlo and his cousin Suchet, which, by the way, they both existed, and the real world that they lived in and the real world that they had to deal with. So the setting is real. The people are real. What they eat is real. But there's a teeny problem here. Everybody's dead. So in order to really understand that, I had a wonderful teacher in graduate school, and he said, your job as a good researcher is to wake the dead and get the living to listen. And there are degrees of deadness. There are things where there is no footprint. And so stuff has to be invented around that, which is pretty neat. I would like to introduce you to what Mary had chosen to read. And this is an example, really, of taking some very interesting facts. For example, almost all of these vessels carried livestock. And unfortunately, they carried livestock to eat them, which is, but not in our book. You can't. Sorry. And so we chose a pig. And Mary Marshall picked out this particular pig. And I said, no, it can't be that kind of a pig. It has to be a very specific Northumberland pig. And it looks like this. And this is what they were raised for. And so we named her the Duchess. And the Duchess was a Duchess. The crew falls in love with her, which I'm sure is probably not true, but it doesn't matter because this is historical fiction. That's the good part. So there's this horrific storm at sea. Joseph Carlo, one of our heroes, is practically washed overboard. The ship's a mess. But don't worry about it, because the most important thing is this. The Duchess was missing. Besides everything else, ripped sails, a damaged spar, several cases of fractured rib, and one broken collarbone, her absence depressed the men's rebounding spirits more than any. Jimmy Duck swore up and down that he'd secured her with more care than the rest of the livestock. On the honor, boys, the poor man attested, twisting a cat between his calloused hands. I put her in her crate. I lashed it in with 4 lines. Not 1, not 2, but 4. And he held up 4 twisted fingers as proof. I loved her as much as the rest of you. I did. Nobody had the heart to blame him. The crate in which the Duchess had been secured lay broken in a livestock pen. Its wooden canes breached in 2 places. There was a splatter of blood on one side, and this upset the investigating sailors most of all. The mood on board was an odd mix of jubilant relief and depression. As to the weather, once the monster storm had blown itself out, the day had broken with scrubbed, clean sky and middling wind. When Joseph Carlo and the rest had set sails to the captain's orders, he made his way down to the deck on shaky legs. Dawn streaks of red and purple illuminated a sky free of clouds. I've never seen anything so beautiful. Suchet had ridden out the storm with Harrison, protecting the watch in its padded box. Harrison was terrified that the watch would get wet, thus spoiling its accuracy. Other than a few bumps and bruises, all 3 of them, Suchet, Harrison, and the watch, were fine. The Deptford has sustained her fair share of injuries during the storm. Everywhere you look, there were frayed blinds, splintered wood. Her hull and rig had held despite the beating she'd taken, and the men were proud of that. But if only they could find the Duchess. For much of this day, Joseph Carlo was on the bilge pumps, bailing out all the seawater that had inundated the ship. It was a laborious process. It took a lot of men and took a lot out of them. Exhausted from a violent, sleepless night, the constant pumping and bailing taxed them more than usual. Joseph Carlo worked shoulder to shoulder with men twice his age and 3 times as strong as their labor and breathing matched his own. My blisters have blisters, said this young man from Ireland. And Joseph Carlo climbed up the narrow steps to the 'tween decks behind the rest of the bailing crew, thinking only of a good dose of grog and a dreamless sleep and a scratching gecko in his hammock, when he heard it underneath the ladder, somewhere in the depths of the storage. He paused, watching the rest of the men tromp up the ladder, all of them too tired to question why he was hanging back. And when everyone had left the lowest deck, he sloshed through the murky seawater to the bow storage area and listened. There was only the swish of the water running by the Deptford's hull, the accordion-like whoosh of the pump. pumps and the steady drip in the bilge and the creak of the ship's wooden bones. Nothing else. It felt as if he were in the belly of some great wooden beast. He gave up and he walked back to the hatch, dragging his feet. But when he reached the stair, it came again. It wasn't a snort. It was an oink. It was faint, but it was an oink. He'd grown up with all manner of animals living close at hand, and he knew the sound of a pig when he heard it. Duchess! Duchess, are you there? Joseph Carlo pushed through the jumbled cargo before the storm. This had been orderly and lashed down, but a night of ferocious winds and waves had thrown the space into disarray. Duchess, he said, Duchess. Still nothing. He shunted the crates around. A broken piece of wood stabbed at his leg as he shoved his way through. He hefted bags of sodden grain out of the way, each time hoping to uncover a frightened Tamworth pig. He'd reached the end of storage and put one hand on the inside of the hull, away from the energy of the ocean rushing by, and still no justice. Defeated, he turned to make his way back through the jumbled clutter of crates and sacks. What? Sound it again? Good question. Joseph Carlo spun, ripping away the last of the broken crates. There, huddled against the front of the storage area in a space too small to accommodate any crate, was a brown pig. The Duchess's eyes glinted in the light of a lantern hanging by the hatch. A smudge of blood stained her snout, and Joseph Carlos voiced a quick prayer. He moved as slowly as possible, taking care not to startle the already frightened pig. And as he approached, he tripped over one of the smashed crates, lunging to keep his balance. The Duchess let out a squeal and shoved herself further back into the bow, hooves scurrying on the wood. Although he hadn't wanted to scare her, he was glad she had reacted so fast. It meant that she wasn't too wounded to move. And without being aware of it, he began crooning an Italian lullaby that Lena used to sing to him. Fala Nina, fala Nana, he sang. He crouched only a few feet from her. Her labored breathing sped up as he reached one trembling hand to her forehead. And he stroked the place between her ears, where she knew she liked to be scratched, avoiding the injured side of her head. She jerked her face away from him at first, but then she continued with the lullaby and his gentle attention, and she relaxed her eyelids, slipping back. And needless to say, they get the Duchess up on deck. Everyone is absolutely delirious, and they take the pig off to the surgeon, the ship surgeon, to get her patched up. And he went, and the final scene in this particular chapter is, he went to sleep with aching muscles, a warm fire burning in his belly and a light heart, listening to the crew's raucous shouts of, "Long live the Duchess! Long live the Duchess!" He'd survived his first storm at sea, and even better, he found the crew's heart in the belly of the ship. It had been a good day. So, what happens next? Well, if Mary Marshall was here, she would say that the problem becomes when you're writing this kind of material is that you can't really lie too well. This is a grim time. This is the 7 Years' War. These are two young kids. They're snatched off a boat. They don't speak English. It's horrendous. And not only that, the Deptford itself was the ship that ultimately propelled Harrison with his ship's watch to the discovery and the proof of longitude. And there's a wonderful scene in here where Joseph Carlo, who is very strong and very brave, and Suchet, who's really smart, Suchet painfully explains to his more robust cousin what longitude actually means. Once you figure it out, you actually know where you are. And then beyond that comes, well, think about it. That's one of the things that we had to do, was really research and take great care that the things that we were saying were true to a certain extent, with the exception of, I'm going to tell you something here in just a minute. We had two classic examples. Mary Marshall is riding away and riding away and riding away. She calls me up and she says, you know, I gotta read this. And I said, okay. Well, the boys are cold, and Mary Marshall's merrily riding along. She said, and they put on their sweaters. And they said, no, they didn't. No, they didn't. What do you mean they didn't put on their sweaters? Of course they put on sweaters. Mary Marshall. In 1762, there's only one place on the entire planet that has sweaters, and that happens to be the very outmost edges of the Hebrides. Nobody has sweaters. They have woolen jackets, and they're made out of boiled wool. She said, well, what's in their pockets? And then we have a scene in there that has, it was one of my favorites. Something occurred to both of us as we're writing this thing. There's this great storm at sea. Joseph Carlo is up in the cross trees, and he needs foul weather gear. Well, I said, oh, wow. Foul weather gear. Let me see. What would foul weather gear look like in 1762? Well, so we did the great foul weather gear search, and it's canvas, and we actually got a piece of canvas, and then we tried covering it with this disgusting stuff that reeks. That was pretty cool. And then we soaked it in water to see how waterproof it really was, and it really isn't all that great. But the cool part is that there is a wonderful terminology, and it's called, that when the sailors all made their own foul weather gear, and they have this thing called body and soul lashing, which I love. And this part, the part that goes around your middle, is so, and it's tied in a very specific way. So when you are about to be washed overboard, which happens all the time, your mate can reach out and grab your body lashing to save your soul. And I thought, wow, that is just fabulous. I love that part. But then also you have to, the boys do find themselves at the Battle of Havana. This is a piece that another piece I'd like to read to you. And you think about it, you're 12, I think he's 13 by the time he's at the Battle of Havana. What is it like to be on a 50-gun vessel at the end of the 7 Years' War, trying to bring down the walls of the Spanish Fort Morro in Cuba? And what did that sound like? What did that look like? What does that do to your head? And so that, because that is really where they were, what would that be like if you had to write about it? And I'd like to share this little piece with you because I think it is, it's pretty spectacular. And I give Mary Marshall high marks for this one. Battle was chaos all the time. It was difficult to keep track of the hours. Clouds of smoke from the cannons obscured the sun and reduced everything into an acrid yellow haze. And still, the attack on the fort continued. Day and night they fired their shots, rolling out the iron beasts and leveling them to bash at the impenetrable castle walls. And then moving off to reload, only to face those walls again. This went on for days and nights and days, and Joseph Carlos lost count as he ran from gun deck to magazine to rigging and back again. The rigging was a devilish place to be, shot flying all around, the smell of sweat and blood and gunpowder stinging his eyes. And from up there, Joseph Carlo tried to maintain control of some of the sails, and thus the Deptford's ability to maneuver the waters below Morro. The other ships of the fleet looked like islands in the yellow atmosphere. And then the reeking breeze enveloped them in another cloud of smoky death, and the sight of the others disappeared. It was worse on the gun deck. A dark, dank corner of hell. The air was filled with sailors' shouts, the groan and shriek of hot metal, and the thunder of shots as they exploded out of the mouths of the guns and were then driven back against their harnesses with ferocious speed. Joseph Carlo clambered up and down the ladder from the magazine to the gun deck, avoiding gun crews working their cannons with bare and soot-stained torsos. The black handkerchiefs they tied around their ears to protect their hearing, blending with the smears of soot and gunpowder on their faces, so they resembled demons. The stink of it was horrific. It stayed with Joseph Carlo everywhere he went. It slid down his throat and stuck there, coating it with a sour taste of gunpowder, war, and death. And then there was the cannon fire. During the first days, he flinched with each thunder roll of the guns, waiting for the shot to raise the deck, the mast, the rigging, sending razor-sharp splinters shooting through his throat, his belly, his back. Every onslaught of shots fired from the fortress, accompanied with lazy puffs of smoke from the castle's gun ports. He was sure it was done. He cringed, waiting for an impact that, as of yet, hadn't come. He felt the guns at his chest, shaking him each and every time. As the days and nights passed, he became so used to the constant shelling, he hardly glanced up, even though the thunder still came every few minutes. The bellow of the guns as they rained down their iron death had become his day-to-day reality. Day and night the guns fired, but to no avail. The walls still held. After a couple of weeks of this nightmare, Joseph Carlo considered that perhaps he was insane. He heard the cannons inside of his skull now, bouncing off the bone. He couldn't taste anything but gunpowder. Eating was mainly a mechanical necessity. Insert, chew, swallow, repeat. Sleeping was worse. His bone-tired body ached from physical activity and the stress of living in a state of constant fright. He wanted so badly to sleep, to escape. But every time he managed to relax, the thunder of the cannons would yank him back. His muscles bunched like marbles under his skin. He was rabbity, jumping at any odd sound. At night, he lay in his hammock, as stiff as a corpse, and covered both ears with his hands as tightly as he could, trying to block out the clamor of death. Pace found him one grim, gray evening as he was trying to do just that. Stuffed into his hammock, hands matched over his ears, and eyes squinted shut. The Marine didn't say anything, he just stood over the boy's hammock. Battle raged. Finally he spoke. "Come on, you're coming with me. We're going ashore." Joseph Carlo got out of his hammock, followed Pace up the ladder. The castle walls still had not fallen. So, when you think about something like this, and you think about this kind of a project, you think about pulling it together, there are these forces that you have to balance. One is the realness of the story. So the truth pins have to be moving forward. Days have to be right. But there has to be a reason to read it. You have to, because if there wasn't any reason to read it, you could just sit down with a history book and, plunder through these little dates and regurgitate that stuff. So one of the things that we found in this story is that how is the hero, how are you, the reader, changed by reading the book? How is that notion of redemption? And there's a scene in here which I won't read to you, because it is my all-time favorite one. I've read it a bazillion times and it still makes me cry. But there are moments in this book and one in particular, where our hero has the great choice, as we all have choices. As we have choices as a country, as we have choices as individuals, and which road do we take? Do we lean into the road of revenge because it's easy, and anger is something that is quenched often with violence, or do we take the high road? And Joseph Carlos is given that choice. I'm not going to tell you what he does. I'm not going to tell you how it happens. So in the end, the story unfolds. We did create, and I find this pretty funny. We have a Northumberland sharpshooter named, his name is Pace. He does not have a last name. He's kind of like Cher. You know, he's a one-name guy. And his nickname is Nightjar. And his nickname is Nightjar because he is a ferocious hunter that is extremely accurate and spends most of his time aloft. That's what Nightjars do. He's also incredibly hot. So we designed this character to be sort of this, you know, we had a wonderful time doing it. Oh, he's got to be 6'3", he's got dark hair, all this other stuff. And that part was really fun. But we needed him. And we needed him to move the story forward in a different way. Did Nightjar exist? Probably. Probably. Could I tell you what his name is? Like, for real? No. Were most of the sharpshooters in 1762 from Northumberland? Yes. You know, so there's enough truth in that to make it a viable character. And he develops this amazing relationship with Joseph Carlo, which is, I think, pretty cool, pretty profound. But it's also that notion of revenge, redemption, coming of age. And so we wore out a couple of seats at Carol's Hungry Mind. It took us about a year to write the first draft and then 2 more years to get it right. We had some funny things that we did. I mean, as Mary Marshall's imagination is incredibly delicious, I'm a huge fan of pedantic, boring, accurate detail. So our working relationship became a very good marriage. We did a lot of really interesting things, like we climbed up masts of sailing ships. We did all kinds of bizarre, wonderful things to get it right, to have a really good feeling for the story. In the end, you know, as we step back, I'm so sorry she's not here, because it's been a really wonderful experience for the two of us. We're already working on another book, and my hope to those of you who are kings, you see, I really am too, but I just am in disguise at the moment, that you can begin to see that history is more than a series of facts, that people live through these things, they breathe, they fall in love, they die, they get sick, that the great fabric of human endeavor then is that we are probably more similar than not. At the end, Joseph Carlo does escape, and you just have to read. Thank you. It's been fun.